Uh, Everyone, thanks for joining us today. It's Tim, your worshipful Bible teacher, today with a few thoughts from the scripture reading that we had today. It's Nehemiah chapter 11 and chapter 12. Sometimes we think that worship needs to be a time of quiet whispers and silent reflection, as if our sanctuary needs to imitate, the atmosphere of a medieval monastery in some way. But I think that Nehemiah had it right as he planned this joyful and loud dedication of the temple that took place in chapter 12. I love to see Christians greet each other before the service with joy in their hearts and join in worship with some gusto. Actually, I'm not even sure if a Baptist preacher should advocate gusto in worship, but I think that's what we see in these verses in this chapter. Now, it starts out with just a list of names, verses 1 to 9. Lists the heads of the priests and Levites who returned from Babylon with Zerubbabel and Joshua. Zerubbabel was the governor, Joshua was the high priest at that time. And in verse 22, we even see that they were able to get some information from the records of King Darius, who unwittingly was helping God's people with an accurate account of those priestly families. By the way, this was not the Darius who threw Daniel in the lion's den. This was a later king we're talking about. But even sought out Levites, verse 27, in all their places to bring them to Jerusalem. Levites at that time were living throughout the land, and they were summoned to the city. Come and help us with worship at the dedication of these walls. I mean, this was an important celebration. The walls were completed, the gates were in place, the plans of the enemy were brought to confusion, and God did it all. It's time to honor Him. And especially the musicians seemed to be much in demand because they needed them for this time of worship with the singers and the cymbals and psalteries and with harps. A psaltery was a kind of harp with 12 strings, but they all needed to be a part of this. This was to be a time of great noisy celebration with clanging cymbals and sounding horns and singers hitting those high C's, that kind of celebration. And to make it even more interesting, in verse 31, Nehemiah brought the leaders of Judah up on the wall. And what a picture that made. Part of their worship that day, they had two massive choirs. They were assembled in two separate parades, but instead of marching through the streets of Jerusalem, they were marching on top of these newly constructed walls. So that way everyone could see what was going on, especially those critics who were going around joking that even a fox would knock down those walls. And what happened was the choirs marched on top of those walls in opposite direction until they met each other in the front of the temple. And verse 42, as they joined together, the singers sang loud with Jezahiah, their overseer. Jezahiah is one of the few choir directors mentioned in the Bible, so he must have been first rate. And actually, isn't it interesting? The text doesn't say how well they sang, but it just says they sang with volume, they sang loud, with enthusiasm. And the result is in the next verse. The joy in Jerusalem was heard a long way off. And when the wall was dedicated, there were some improvements in temple worship. The rooms are mentioned here. They were used to store offerings that made it possible for the priests and the Levites and the singers and the gatekeepers to devote themselves to worship. This was not meant to be amateur hour. No, this was an occupation. And it was important that they be allowed to devote themselves to their very best that they had to offer when it came to worship. That's important because things change quickly. You'll see that in chapter 13 when we get there. But when we get to the book of Revelation, one of the things that impresses me as I read that book is that heaven is a noisy place. In Revelation 5, 11, and 12, we read that the voice of many angels round about the throne and the beasts and the elders, and the number of them was 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice, "Worthy is the Lamb." In Revelation chapter 6:10, we see the martyrs under the throne. They cried with a loud voice, saying, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood?" In chapter 7, Revelation 9 and 10, a great multitude which no man could number of all the nations and kindreds and people and tongues stood before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palms in their hands, and cried with a loud voice, saying, "Salvation to our God which sitteth upon the throne and unto the Lamb." All right, yes, I think there are times when our worship should take the form maybe of quiet reflection or humble contrition before our God. But there are times when nothing less than enthusiastic praise should ring in the rafters of our sanctuaries. I love to hear it. I think God does too. Well, give that some thought today. Will you meditate on that and on our worship and the God who seems to enjoy loud worship as you consider this today? Stay in the Word. Tomorrow, our reading is just one chapter, Nehemiah chapter 13, and that'll wrap up our study in the book of Nehemiah. Have a great day, folks, and I look forward to being with you again tomorrow. See you then.